Hello there and welcome back to the Sleep Science, where the boundaries between what you know, what you guess, and what you can barely imagine tend to blur like fog on a cold window. Tonight your journey begins inside your own head, or at least inside the head-sized storm of electrical crackles and chemical whispers that you carry everywhere without ever truly noticing. You're sitting here, in the dim quiet, eyelids heavy, listening to words drift past you. And yet behind those eyelids, neurons are flashing like city lights seen from an airplane. One tiny cell sends a spark to another, and then another, and somehow that becomes a thought, a memory, or maybe just the faint awareness that your foot feels itchy. The funny part, you probably won't survive this journey, at least not in the way your everyday self imagines survival. Because tonight we're taking your consciousness apart, putting it under the microscope, and then tossing it into the strange machinery of physics where it doesn't quite fit. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, I'd love to know where you're watching from and what time it is as you drift into this rabbit hole. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The first thing you feel is the pulse of electricity, tiny surges racing down thin fibers in your brain like cars on a midnight highway. These are your neurons, and you've got about 86 billion of them packed into that wrinkly lump inside your skull. Each one is buzzing, waiting for the next signal, the next reason to pass along a charge. You imagine yourself shrinking, diving down into the grey folds, and everywhere you look are little bursts of light, popping like camera flashes in an old paparazzi crowd. You could almost laugh at the absurdity. Here you are, a whole human with opinions about pizza toppings and Netflix shows, yet all of it boils down to these sparks firing in the dark. Some of those sparks move quick, just a few milliseconds and the message has zipped along. Others wait for chemicals to float across a gap, like tossing a paper airplane between rooftops. The gaps are called synapses, and they are the bottlenecks of your entire experience. Every dream, every anxiety about whether you locked the door, every sudden craving for chocolate, those all depend on neurotransmitters drifting across these microscopic spaces. Historians still argue whether it was Ramon Cajal's sketches or later electron microscope photos that finally convinced the scientific world that neurons are separate units rather than one continuous web. Either way, the fact remains. Your consciousness is stitched together not by a single fabric, but by billions of tiny jumps, sparks leaping through gaps like frogs across lily pads. You wander deeper, and the scenery becomes stranger. Some neurons are huge, stretching axons long enough to run from your spinal cord down into your toes. Others are short and stubby, like little neighbourhood gossipers, whispering only to their immediate neighbours. Together they form networks that look eerily like tangled forests, branches overlapping, roots intertwining, and inside that forest is you, the awareness that is somehow both hidden and revealed by the tangle. Here's a quirky tidbit. The electricity racing through you isn't purely biological. It's the same kind of electricity that runs your laptop charger. The brain doesn't have its own secret kind of energy. It just uses familiar electrons riding sodium and potassium waves. Yet somehow this everyday physics feels different when it's you experiencing it. As you stroll through this inner landscape, a strange thought occurs. If neurons are just circuits, then why does the whole thing feel like you? A light bulb doesn't suddenly think it's Napoleon when current passes through. Your phone doesn't get embarrassed when it buzzes at the wrong moment. So what gives? The scientific story says consciousness emerges from patterns of firing, the way one network synchronizes with another, the way electrical rhythms line up. But there's still a yawning gap, like a missing page in a novel. How does firing become feeling? How does voltage become the taste of strawberries or the ache of nostalgia? Even now, neuroscientists shake their heads, because the puzzle isn't just complicated, it might be impossible to answer using the tools we have. For a moment, you picture yourself inside an fMRI scanner, lying there while magnets hum, your brain lighting up on a monitor like a weather map of storms. The scientist outside can point to a blob and say, "This is where language happens," or "This is where you remember faces." It's impressive, sure, but also oddly hollow. They can track the traffic, but not the traveller. They can tell when a neuron fires, but not why that firing feels like your secret inner voice rather than meaningless static. The joke writes itself. If a neuron fires in the forest and nobody interprets it, does it really produce consciousness? And yet, the show goes on. Your neurons never stop, even when you sleep. They cycle through rhythms, slow waves, REM bursts, odd little pulses like the beating of distant drums. Right now, even as you drift with me, your auditory cortex is decoding these words, your prefrontal cortex is tagging them as meaningful or not, and your hippocampus may decide later whether to keep the memory. All of it is busy work, a hidden factory running night and day, and you barely pay attention. Which is ironic, since attention itself is one of the few things your neurons actually argue about. That spotlight feeling, focusing on one thing while ignoring the rest, is the product of competing networks trying to outshout each other. Somewhere in the noise, a winner emerges, and you call it your train of thought. You pause at one particularly odd corner of the brain, the claustrum, a thin sheet of neurons that some researchers think could be the conductor of the orchestra. The late Francis Crick, co-discoverer of DNA, once suspected this little sliver might be central to consciousness itself. But the claustrum is elusive, tucked away and hard to study, like the VIP lounge of the neural nightclub. Some people lose parts of it and remain conscious, others don't. Historians still argue whether the claustrum deserves its reputation, or whether it's just another overhyped guest star. Meanwhile, down in the brainstem, basic survival keeps humming. Heartbeat regulation, breathing rhythms, reflexes, all handled automatically, as if your body has its own autopilot. You can thank evolution for that convenience. Without it, you'd forget to inhale every time you got distracted by a cat video. And let's be honest, humanity would have gone extinct in record time if survival required remembering every breath. Instead, your neurons politely free up space so you can ponder philosophy, quantum physics, or whether pineapple belongs on pizza. Spoiler, it does, but only if you're in a playful mood. Now the funny part sneaks in. For all this high-tech firing, your brain is shockingly inefficient. It runs on about 20 watts, roughly the power of a dim light bulb. Compare that to your computer, which gulps energy yet still struggles to tell a cat photo from a loaf of bread. Somehow your 20-watt brain juggles languages, emotions, motor skills, and the occasional embarrassing memory from middle school. And here's the kicker. Despite all this frugal brilliance, you can't even remember where you left your keys yesterday. So maybe efficiency has its limits. The deeper you peer, the more you realize that the brainstorm of sparks is both impressive and inadequate. On one hand, it explains everything we do in the waking world. On the other, it leaves you dangling with the same old question. How does this electrical carnival turn into awareness? Philosophers call it the hard problem, and you feel its weight like a stone in your pocket. You've mapped out the neurons, tracked the neurotransmitters, charted the rhythms, and yet consciousness still sits there like a magician refusing to reveal the trick. And maybe that's where the stage is set for tonight's stranger journey. You've walked through the basics, neurons firing, sparks leaping gaps, networks buzzing in orchestrated storms. You've felt the machinery, the city-at-night glow of the brain at work. But somewhere deep inside, you can't shake the suspicion that this explanation isn't the whole story. Maybe, just maybe, something stranger lurks beneath the surface, something the ordinary rules of physics can't quite capture. And with that suspicion, you turn toward a different kind of light, the shimmering, slippery light of quantum mechanics, waiting for you in the next step of the dream. You shuffle forward from that glowing forest of neurons into a calmer corridor of thought, where the world of traditional neuroscience waits with its tidy diagrams and reassuring arrows. Here, things are supposed to make sense. Cause leads to effect, currents travel in one direction, and chemicals play their roles like clockwork gears. This is the classical brain, the explanation most scientists use to understand your inner life without calling in the spooky ghosts of quantum strangeness. You look around, and it feels almost mechanical, like peering into the back of an old radio. Signals go in, wires vibrate, dials adjust, and something coherent comes out. The beauty of it is simplicity. Consciousness reduced to patterns of firing neurons and chemical baths, all humming along like a predictable machine. The story usually starts with the neuron itself, that unassuming building block of your awareness. Neurons receive inputs through their branching dendrites, crunch those inputs in the cell body, and send outputs along their axons. Wrapped around many axons is the myelin sheath, a fatty insulation that lets signals race like express trains rather than sluggish commuters. You might smirk at the thought. Your thoughts literally depend on insulation, not so different from the electrical wires in your wall. Without myelin, your mental life would crawl, and diseases like multiple sclerosis show exactly what happens when this insulation falters. Messages stumble, movements glitch, and consciousness feels suddenly fragile. At every junction, neurotransmitters do their delicate dance. A signal reaches the end of an axon, vesicles pop open, and chemicals spill into the synapse like tiny perfume bottles uncorked in the night. Serotonin, dopamine, glutamate. Each one carries its flavor of information, binding to receptors on the other side. The receiving neuron sniffs the chemical and decides whether to fire. It's a system that's both mechanical and poetic, a factory of sparks powered by little chemical love letters. A quirky tidbit for you: some of these neurotransmitters, like serotonin, are not produced mainly in your brain at all. The majority of serotonin in your body is made in your gut, reminding you that your mood may depend less on your brain and more on your lunch. Zooming out, the brain looks like a vast electrical grid. Populations of neurons synchronize their firing, creating oscillations you can measure as brain waves. Beta waves buzz while you're focused. Alpha waves drift in when you're relaxed. Theta waves slide through drowsy moments, and delta waves lull you into deep sleep. These rhythms aren't just pretty squiggles on an EEG. They regulate communication across distant brain regions, like radio stations tuning into each other. Historians still argue whether Hans Berger, who first recorded EEG signals in the 1920s, fully realized he was opening a window into consciousness itself, or just tinkering with medical gadgets. Either way, the discovery gave humanity its first non-invasive glimpse at the living brain's electrical symphony. And here's the kicker: the classical brain theory works. It explains reflexes, motor control, language processing, even the brain's ability to recover after injury. Surgeons can stimulate certain regions with tiny electrical currents and trigger specific movements, memories, or feelings. The predictability is comforting, like a user manual for your own mind. When dopamine circuits falter, Parkinson's disease creeps in. When serotonin levels wobble, depression casts its long shadow. You can treat these conditions, at least partially, with drugs that nudge the chemical balance. So the story holds: neurons are machines, neurotransmitters are messengers, and consciousness emerges from their interplay like music from a player piano. But even in this orderly framework, you feel a faint tug of doubt. If the brain is just a machine, why does it feel like this? Why isn't your awareness cold and mechanical, like the clicking of typewriter keys? Instead, it's warm, personal, filled with colour and sensation. Classical neuroscience tells you how neurons fire and circuits connect, but it doesn't explain why sunlight looks golden, or why the sound of rain makes you nostalgic. This mismatch is like reading a recipe for cake that never mentions sweetness. You can follow the steps perfectly, but the essence of the experience is missing. Still, there's a kind of comfort in the mechanical view. Picture an old switchboard, wires crisscrossing, operators plugging cables in and out. That's your brain at work, clumsy yet effective, clattering away as it keeps the lights on. Your working memory, for instance, juggles bits of information by circulating them in loops, neurons firing and refiring like children chanting a rhyme to avoid forgetting the words. When you finally lose track, the loop collapses and the thought slips into oblivion. It's a little tragic, but also comical. Your mighty brain, capable of contemplating the cosmos, can't remember a phone number for more than 30 seconds without rehearsal. Classical neuroscience also lays out the brain's geography like a tourist map. The occipital lobe at the back handles vision. The temporal lobe processes sound and memory. The parietal lobe deals with spatial awareness, and the frontal lobe orchestrates higher reasoning and decision-making. It's like wandering through different neighbourhoods of a city, each with its own vibe. Some areas specialise, others overlap, and together they give you the full urban sprawl of consciousness. Of course, the boundaries blur and neuroscientists debate whether strict localization is too simplistic. Historians still argue whether the famous case of Phineas Gage, the railroad worker who survived an iron rod blasting through his skull, proves that personality is stored in the frontal lobes or whether his recovery complicates the story. But don't let the drama distract you from the quirks. For example, your neurons don't always behave like orderly switches. Sometimes they misfire, sending random spikes or bursting into epileptic storms. Other times they fall quiet, creating eerie silences that feel like blackouts in the city grid. These imperfections are part of what makes the brain flexible, able to improvise. In fact, if every neuron behaved perfectly, your brain might be as rigid as a pocket calculator, fast but unimaginative. The occasional hiccup adds texture, unpredictability, maybe even creativity. Think of it as jazz instead of sheet music. Not every note is planned, but the improvisation carries its own beauty. And so you linger in this classical picture, the hum of wires and chemicals filling your imagination. It's a world where neurons explain most of what you do, and consciousness is just the emergent chatter of an insanely complex machine. But the nagging itch won't go away. Machines don't dream. Wires don't fall in love. Chemicals don't stare at the stars and wonder if they are alive. Yet you do all of these things, daily, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Maybe, you think, the classical story is true as far as it goes, but maybe it doesn't go far enough. And with that gentle unease, you glance toward the edges of the stage, where shadows ripple in ways the tidy diagrams can't explain. The air grows slippery, paradoxical, hinting at another layer of reality. You can almost feel the presence of physics waiting in the wings, tapping its foot impatiently. The neurons have had their turn, the chemicals have sung their part. Now the curtain is about to rise on something stranger, something that whispers of cats both alive and dead, of particles that vanish when observed, of mysteries that might just entangle your very thoughts. You stand at the edge of that tidy classical story, and you can already feel the cracks spreading through it like hairline fractures in porcelain. The wiring and chemicals model is neat, reassuring, even practical, but every time you look closer, the same unsettling question whispers back. Is it really enough? You can explain reflexes, you can explain motor control, you can even explain how serotonin makes you feel marginally more cheerful after a slice of cake. But what about the mysteries that don't fit so cleanly? These are the little leaks in the machine, the places where consciousness refuses to be boxed up neatly. Tonight, you press your ear against those cracks and listen to the strange echoes seeping through. The first riddle is called the binding problem. Imagine you're watching a dog run across a park. One part of your brain handles the motion, another handles the colour, another the sound of paws on gravel, and yet somehow you experience it as one seamless dog. Classical neuroscience says each feature gets processed separately, but it struggles to explain how they recombine into a unified perception. It's like having 30 chefs cook different ingredients in separate kitchens. Yet somehow a single plate of lasagna appears on your table. Historians still argue whether the brain solves this puzzle through neural synchrony, groups of neurons firing in lockstep, or whether some hidden mechanism we haven't yet uncovered is at play. Either way, your unified sense of dogness remains one of neuroscience's great unsolved puzzles. Then comes the riddle of attention, the mysterious spotlight that lets you tune into my words right now while ignoring the hum of the refrigerator. Classical theories say attention is just networks competing for resources, like children shouting to be heard. But that doesn't explain the sheer vividness of the spotlight, the way it feels to focus on one thing and let the rest fall away. Attention feels intentional, almost like a director choosing which scene belongs in the final cut of the movie. And here's a quirky tidbit. Studies show that your brain often decides where to focus milliseconds before you consciously feel like you've chosen. That means your starring role as the attentive director may actually be more like an actor improvising lines after the fact. But the deepest crack is what philosophers call the hard problem of consciousness. You can explain the brain's mechanics all day, how signals fire, how circuits connect, how behaviours emerge, but that still doesn't answer why experience feels like something. Why does the smell of coffee flood your morning with warmth, instead of just triggering a series of efficient wake-up behaviours? Why does heartbreak hurt in the chest, even though it's just neurons misfiring in your brain? Classical neuroscience waves its hands and says, emergence, but that's really just code for we don't know. It's as if you opened a user manual and found the words, Step 5, magic happens. Not very satisfying, especially if you're hoping for an instruction sheet to your own existence. The hard problem leads naturally into the strange territory of qualia, the private, subjective qualities of your experiences. What does red look like to you? Is it the same red I see? Classical theories can measure wavelengths of light. They can trace the path from retinas to cortex, but they can't tell whether the redness in your mind is the same as mine. Some philosophers, like Thomas Nagel, put it bluntly: you can study a bat's sonar system until the cows come home, but you'll never know what it's like to be a bat. And if you can't even solve the bat, how do you hope to solve yourself? You take another step and find yourself face to face with free will, that old philosophical troublemaker. Neuroscience experiments show that your brain often starts preparing an action milliseconds before you feel the conscious decision to act. Benjamin Libet's famous studies in the 1980s found this gap between unconscious preparation and conscious awareness, sparking endless debate. Are you really choosing, or are you just narrating decisions your brain already made? Historians still argue whether these results disprove free will, or merely reveal that choice operates at a different level than we imagined. Either way, it feels unnerving, like discovering you're a character in a play who only thinks they're improvising. The cracks spread further when you look at dreams. During REM sleep, your brain spins entire worlds, complete with colours, sounds, emotions, even bizarre plots, yet you rarely question their reality until you wake. Classical explanations point to random firing consolidated into narratives, but that doesn't fully explain why dreams can feel so immersive, so emotionally charged. Nor does it explain lucid dreams, where awareness sneaks in and reshapes the narrative midstream. If neurons alone are responsible, why can the dream self sometimes seize control and bend the rules of its own physics? And then there's the unsettling reality of consciousness disorders: coma, vegetative states, locked-in syndrome. Classical neuroscience maps activity, but it can't always explain the line between awareness and unawareness. Some patients appear unresponsive yet show brain activity that suggests inner experience. Others look awake but lack any trace of selfhood. The boundaries blur, leaving doctors guessing and families hoping. A quirky case from history. A French journalist with locked-in syndrome dictated an entire memoir by blinking his left eyelid. His mind was intact, his neurons firing, yet the classical story couldn't fully bridge the gap between inner life and outer silence. The deeper you wander, the more you feel that the classical framework is sturdy but incomplete. It's like walking through a house built on solid stone, only to notice the occasional draft seeping through the walls. You're grateful the roof doesn't collapse, but you can't help wondering what's hidden in the gaps. Maybe it's just unfinished masonry. Or maybe, just maybe, there's another structure beyond the walls altogether, one that classical neuroscience can't even see. And here's where the tension sharpens. Scientists love explanations that are testable, measurable, and replicable. Classical neuroscience gives them all of that. But consciousness keeps slipping through their fingers like water, refusing to be bottled. It's a bit like trying to study laughter by measuring the air pressure of giggles. You can get data, sure, but the essence of the experience laughs back at you. You can't quite reduce it, not without losing something essential. So you stand at the threshold, neurons humming behind you, the cracks of mystery widening before you. The questions of binding, attention, qualia, free will, and dreaming hover like fireflies in the night. The classical brain has done its best, but its lantern light only reaches so far. And beyond that circle of light, something stranger stirs. A physics that defies intuition, a set of rules that suggest reality itself might be slipperier than you thought. You feel yourself leaning toward it, like a moth toward a candle, knowing it could burn but unable to resist. The cracks have done their work. They've primed you for the leap into the surreal, where Schrödinger waits with his infamous box and his inscrutable cat. You step across that threshold and immediately the air shifts, bending in on itself as if reality has decided to stop playing by its own rules. Here, in the strange landscape of quantum mechanics, logic gets twisted into origami, and the very ground beneath your thoughts feels less like solid stone and more like quicksand. Classical neuroscience might have felt incomplete, but at least it was comfortable. Neurons, chemicals, circuits, tidy diagrams. Quantum mechanics, though, greets you with a sly grin, offering paradoxes wrapped in equations that almost dare you to sleep through them. You can't, of course, because your mind is buzzing at the thought of cats that are both alive and dead, particles that only exist when you look at them, and a universe that seems to play peekaboo with itself. At the heart of this carnival is the wave-particle duality, the idea that something as tiny as an electron can behave both like a particle and like a wave, depending on how you look at it. Imagine flicking a marble across a table. Classical physics expects it to clink and roll like, well, a marble. But in the quantum world, that marble sometimes behaves like a ripple in a pond spreading out, interfering with itself and generally making a mockery of everyday intuition. Historians still argue whether Einstein was genuinely horrified by this or just theatrically grumpy when he muttered, "God does not play dice." Either way, dice are clearly rattling somewhere in the dark and you're caught in the roll. The strangest demonstration of this trick is the double-slit experiment. You picture yourself setting up a simple test. Fire particles at a barrier with 2 slits, then see where they land on the wall behind. Classical logic predicts 2 neat piles. Instead, you get an interference pattern, ripples as if each particle went through both slits at once and interfered with itself. It's as if your marble not only rolled straight but also decided to split into ghost versions of itself, dance through every possible path, and then reconvene to compare notes before hitting the wall. Even stranger, the moment you set up a detector to check which slit it goes through, the interference pattern vanishes. Observation itself changes the outcome, as if the universe has stage fright and only performs its wave trick when no one's watching. You glance at Schrödinger's infamous cat, eternally stuck in its box, both alive and dead until someone peeks inside. You imagine the poor feline pacing in ghostly uncertainty, tails twitching in overlapping realities. Schrödinger, to be fair, didn't actually believe his cat was real. The whole thought experiment was meant to mock the absurdity of quantum rules when applied to ordinary objects. But the image has stuck, haunting pop culture, science classrooms, and probably every sleep-deprived grad student with a sense of humour. Here's a quirky tidbit. Physicists have, in fact, created Schrödinger's cat states with microscopic systems, tiny particles placed in overlapping conditions. No meows included, but enough to keep the metaphor alive. Another ghostly guest at this carnival is superposition. At quantum scales, particles don't just choose one state. They hover in a blend of possibilities until forced to decide. It's like ordering both pizza and sushi, keeping both meals in a probability cloud and only collapsing into a choice when the delivery guy knocks. Everyday life doesn't allow this nonsense. You don't simultaneously brush your teeth and sleep in bed. But at the level of atoms, the rules are different. And here's the deliciously unnerving thought. If your brain relies on these particles, could your thoughts also hover in superposition? Are you right now, both awake and dreaming, collapsed into wakefulness only because your attention measured it? Of course, the real party trick of quantum mechanics is entanglement. 2 particles interact and suddenly they're linked no matter how far apart they drift. Measure one, and the other instantly reveals its matching property, faster than light, as if whispering secrets across the cosmos. Einstein called it spooky action at distance, and despite his protest, experiments keep confirming it. You lean into the image, 2 particles dancing in sync across the universe, separated by light years yet moving as one. It feels less like physics and more like romance, the ultimate long-distance relationship. And you can't help but wonder whether neurons, or perhaps whole minds, might someday reveal such eerie synchronization. But here's the twist that makes your sleepy brain both ache and giggle. Nobody really knows why quantum mechanics works. The equations are precise, predictive, and stunningly accurate, but the interpretation of what they mean is a battlefield. The Copenhagen interpretation says particles only choose when observed. The many worlds interpretation insists every possibility plays out in branching universes, making you one of countless versions of yourself right now. Other interpretations, pilot waves, relational quantum mechanics, transactional models, multiply like rabbits, each claiming to solve the riddle. Historians still argue whether these interpretations are science or philosophy dressed in lab coats. Meanwhile, the experiments just keep working, shrugging off the confusion like cosmic pranksters. What makes it all worse, or better depending on your taste for paradox, is that quantum weirdness isn't tucked away in some abstract realm. It underlies everything. Every atom in your body obeys these rules. Every neuron, every thought. Every breath is built from particles that follow quantum mechanics. Yet, at your scale, things appear solid and predictable. You're not dissolving into probability clouds every time you blink, thank goodness. Instead, some process called decoherence forces quantum strangeness into classical normality. When systems interact with their environment, it's like the universe has a strict bouncer, ejecting quantum antics as soon as too many particles get involved. Still, the allure of the quantum carnival is irresistible. You feel it tugging at the edges of your consciousness, whispering that maybe, just maybe, this is where the missing page of the brain's user manual hides. If observation changes particles, could consciousness itself be part of the machinery? If superposition holds states until collapse, could awareness ride that wave? These questions are wild, speculative, and enough to make classical neuroscientists groan into their coffee. But they're also the reason you're still awake, leaning deeper into the dream of physics as if it were telling secrets just for you. So here you are, neurons behind you, paradoxes before you, and Schrödinger's cat purring in limbo somewhere nearby. You can feel the stage set for the next act, where pioneers dared to stitch consciousness to quantum mechanics, boldly proposing that the ghost in the machine might be more than a metaphor. You smirk, because deep down you know what's coming. Half the scientists will call it brilliant, the other half will call it nonsense, and somewhere in between lies the space where your thoughts will wander tonight. You tiptoe further into the carnival of quantum strangeness, and in the corner you notice a group of pioneers waving notebooks like torches, their eyes wide with conviction. These are the early dreamers, the ones who dare to whisper that consciousness might not just use quantum mechanics, but might actually require it. They weren't all fringe mystics with incense and crystals, though a few certainly enjoyed that aesthetic. No, among them were serious physicists, biologists and philosophers, all peering into the brain and thinking, classical mechanics alone, surely that can't be the whole story. You settle among them, listening as they sketch wild theories into the smoky air. One of the earliest bold voices was the mathematician and philosopher John von Neumann, who in the 1930s suggested that consciousness plays a role in collapsing quantum wave functions. According to him, the measuring device, the lab, even the universe itself could all be entangled, but the chain only stops when a conscious observer steps in. You might chuckle at the audacity. Von Neumann basically made human awareness the final referee of reality, like the universe is waiting for your nod before choosing an outcome. Historians still argue whether he was dead serious or simply pointing out a philosophical gap in physics. Either way, his idea planted a seed that still sprouts in late-night dorm room debates. Then came Eugene Wigner, Nobel-winning physicist and quantum troublemaker, who sharpened the claim. He proposed that consciousness doesn't just observe collapse, it causes it. Wigner even spun up a thought experiment. Wigner's Friend, where two observers can disagree on whether a measurement has collapsed until one communicates with the other. It's like reality holds its breath, waiting for awareness to synchronize. A quirky tidbit. Wigner later softened his stance, realizing the implications were a little too spooky even for him. Still, his name lingers in the conversation, forever tied to the notion that your thoughts might sculpt reality itself. Not all early explorers wore physicist badges. In the 1960s and 70s, psychedelic culture burst onto the scene, and with it came an appetite for theories blending quantum mechanics with mind expansion. Some thinkers argued that altered states revealed glimpses of quantum consciousness, that LSD trips and meditative trances were doorways into the probabilistic soup beneath reality. Mainstream scientists rolled their eyes, muttering about New Age nonsense, but the cultural impact was undeniable. And who knows? Maybe the boundaries blurred not because the ideas were wrong, but because they were painted with too much tie-dye. The medical world, too, dipped a toe into the mystery. British psychiatrist Karl Pribram proposed the holonomic brain theory, inspired by holograms and quantum mathematics. He suggested memories weren't stored in neat little boxes but distributed across the brain, like interference patterns in a holographic plate. Slice off a piece, and the whole image is still there. Just fuzzier. Neuroscience later confirmed some aspects. Memories really are distributed. But whether quantum principles were essential remained controversial. Historians still argue whether Pribram's theory was a profound leap or just an overextended metaphor. Either way, it caught imaginations, especially among those who sensed that the brain's machinery might be more wave-like than clock-like. In the 1970s and 80s, Henry Stapp, an American physicist, carried the torch further, insisting that quantum mechanics leaves room for free will and mind-matter interaction. For Stapp, consciousness wasn't an afterthought of the brain. It was fundamental to the unfolding of reality. Reading his work feels like wandering through a cathedral built of equations and metaphysics, where every line whispers, "You matter more than you think." Skeptics called it poetic overreach. Admirers called it visionary. Either way, his arguments gave voice to that nagging suspicion. Maybe classical mechanics really does stop short of explaining you. And then, of course, the popular imagination took over. Self-help gurus, motivational speakers, and entire publishing industries latched onto the idea of quantum consciousness. Suddenly, quantum became shorthand for mystery and magic. Quantum healing, quantum attraction, quantum coffee mugs. You roll your eyes a little, but you also can't help smiling. A word that once terrified physicists with its equations had become a marketing slogan. A quirky tidbit. There are still yoga studios today promising quantum detox, which, to be clear, is not something Heisenberg ever signed off on. But beneath the noise, serious seeds remained. Each pioneer, whether von Neumann with his chains of observation, Wigner with his collapsing awareness, Pribram with his holograms, or Stapp with his metaphysics, pointed to the same unsettling crack. Consciousness doesn't fit neatly into the classical box. The brain looks like a machine, yes, but the experience of being alive seems to demand more. These early explorers weren't always right, and sometimes they wandered into fringe territory, but they gave permission to ask the forbidden question, what if the mind really is quantum? As you linger with them, you feel a kind of camaraderie, like fellow insomniacs swapping stories under starlight. They don't promise answers, only provocations. They remind you that science too has its dreamers, its rebels willing to blur the line between physics and philosophy. And though skeptics may laugh, you notice something comforting about their audacity. After all, without dreamers you'd never have theories to test, and without theories you'd never have mysteries to wonder about. And so you lean back, the laughter of skeptics echoing faintly in the distance, the whispers of pioneers curling closer. They've laid the groundwork, rough and controversial though it is, for the next bold leap. Because just ahead waits a pair of names, Penrose and Hameroff, who dared to stitch quantum mechanics directly into the scaffolding of the brain. Compared to their proposal, tonight's earlier ideas were just a warm-up. You drift into a dim chamber where two figures sit at a table, sketches and equations scattered between coffee cups gone cold. One is Sir Roger Penrose, a mathematician knighted for his work in physics, whose name echoes in the halls of black hole theory. The other is Stuart Hameroff, an anesthesiologist who spent his days coaxing patients into and out of oblivion. Together they built one of the boldest proposals in the entire field of consciousness studies, that your awareness comes not from neurons alone, but from the shimmering quantum vibrations hidden inside the brain scaffolding. You settle in to hear their story, the tale of orchestrated objective reduction, or OR for short, a name that sounds half symphony, half science fiction. Penrose started it with a puzzle. Classical physics, he argued, could never explain consciousness. He believed the mind wasn't just an emergent property of neurons firing. Instead, it must rely on non-computable processes, the kind that algorithms and step-by-step calculations can't capture. He linked this to Gödel's incompleteness theorem, which showed that any logical system has truths it can't prove. For Penrose, human understanding felt similar, capable of grasping insights that couldn't be reduced to mechanical rules. So he turned to quantum physics, hoping to find a place where the non-algorithmic might flourish. Historians still argue whether his leap from Gödel to neurons was genius or a category error, but the leap landed, and it pointed straight toward the brain. Enter Hameroff. While Penrose wandered the cosmos of mathematics, Hameroff spent his career staring into cells. He became fascinated by microtubules, the slender cylindrical structures that form the cytoskeleton of cells. In textbooks, microtubules are the construction scaffolds, support beams, intracellular highways, conveyors of molecular cargo. But Hameroff saw something more. They were structured, ordered, latticed in ways that looked eerily like they could host quantum processes. When he teamed up with Penrose in the early 1990s, the marriage of their ideas created or the claim that microtubules could sustain quantum vibrations, and that these vibrations, orchestrated across networks of neurons, gave rise to consciousness. The heart of Orkor is wild but elegant. Inside microtubules, electrons might exist in superpositions, vibrating collectively like strings of a cosmic harp. These superpositions collapse not by random environmental interference, but by what Penrose called objective reduction, a fundamental process tied to the very fabric of space-time. When these collapses occur, orchestrated by biological systems, they create discrete moments of conscious experience. In other words, your awareness is not a smooth river, but a flickering film reel, each frame collapsing from quantum haze into the sharpness of now. You almost laugh at the thought. You're a stop-motion cartoon stitched together by space-time itself. Hameroff brought his anesthesiologist insight to the table. He argued that anesthetics, which switch consciousness off like a light, work precisely because they target microtubules, disrupting their quantum coherence. This would explain why losing awareness under anesthesia feels so absolute, so different from ordinary sleep. Classical neuroscience says anesthesia blocks neural communication, but Hameroff insisted the deeper truth lay in quantum disruption. A quirky tidbit: some studies suggest that anesthetics do indeed bind to proteins in microtubules, though whether this affects quantum processes remains a matter of fierce debate. Naturally, Ork met a storm of criticism. Skeptics declared the brain too warm, wet, and noisy for fragile quantum states. Quantum coherence, they said, could only survive in ultra-cold, isolated systems like superconductors, not in the messy soup of biology. To them, Ork was like trying to perform ballet in the middle of a mosh pit, delicate quantum choreography drowned in chaos. Historians still argue whether Penrose and Hameroff underestimated these challenges, or whether new discoveries in quantum biology might vindicate them. But the pair pressed on. Over the decades, Ork has evolved, and incorporating evidence that quantum effects do exist in biological systems, photosynthesis, bird navigation, even the sense of smell. Hameroff cheerfully points to these examples as proof that nature can indeed maintain quantum order in warm environments. If plants and birds can do it, why not neurons? And Penrose, with his gravitas, insists that objective reduction isn't just an exotic add-on, but a fundamental feature of the universe. Together they've created a theory that refuses to die, no matter how many skeptics sharpen their knives. You lean back, trying to imagine microtubules humming with quantum vibrations. Each neuron contains billions of them, lattices crisscrossing like the beams of skyscrapers. If Ork is right, your consciousness is a symphony played on trillions of these tiny instruments, their vibrations collapsing into awareness again and again. It's both dizzying and strangely intimate. The thought that your entire sense of self rests not in the broad strokes of brain regions, but in the secret tremors of your cell's scaffolding. Of course, critics counter with simpler explanations. They argue that anesthesia disrupts consciousness by interfering with synaptic communication, not microtubules. They point to models showing how classical processes could produce the same effects. They even accuse Ork of being unfalsifiable, more philosophy than science. And yet you notice the theory refuses to fade. Conferences still host debates, papers still get published, and Hameroff still grins on stage, undeterred by decades of eye rolls. Maybe that's the mark of an idea worth keeping around. Not that it's correct, but that it keeps asking questions others are afraid to touch. You smile at the paradox. On one hand, Ork could be a groundbreaking bridge between physics and mind, the missing link tying neurons to the quantum world. On the other, it could be a beautiful mirage, a castle built on shimmering probability waves. Either way, it stirs your imagination, nudging you to picture consciousness not as a simple circuit board but as a cosmic performance, orchestrated at the edge of reality itself. And as the hum of microtubules fades in your ears, you sense the next act approaching, the backlash, the skeptics sharpening their logic, ready to declare that warm brains are the last place you'll ever find quantum coherence. Their voices grow louder in the distance, preparing to drag you back toward reason. For now, though, you hold on to the image of yourself as a quantum symphony, each moment of awareness a note struck on the vibrating strings of space-time. You don't get to linger long in the glow of microtubule harps before the skeptics arrive. Arms crossed, voices sharp, their brows furrowed in the dim light of the lab. They've been waiting for this moment, ready to poke holes in Orcor and every other attempt to drag quantum mechanics into neuroscience. Their central complaint comes at you like a hammer. The brain is simply too warm, wet and noisy for delicate quantum effects to survive. Quantum coherence, they remind you, requires isolation. Particles tucked away in cryogenic chambers, shielded from environmental interference. In the warm chaos of your skull, with ions flooding and molecules bouncing like bumper cars, quantum states should decohere in femtoseconds. And femtoseconds, in case you're keeping track, are not long enough for anything resembling thought. The physicist Max Tegmark once ran calculations on this very question, crunching the numbers on whether microtubules could sustain quantum superpositions. His verdict? Decoherence in the brain would occur so fast it might as well be instantaneous, far quicker than neurons could ever use. You picture his conclusion like a cartoon, quantum states popping into existence and collapsing before they can even clear their throats, a cosmic comedy where the music never begins. Historians still argue whether Tegmark's calculations closed the door on Orcor or simply underestimated how biology might cheat the rules. But for many scientists, his paper was a mic drop. The skeptics don't stop there. They point to decades of progress in classical neuroscience, where models of neurons and synapses explain memory, perception, decision-making, and even anesthesia without invoking quantum magic. Why build castles in the clouds when the ground is already solid? They'll remind you that drugs like ketamine or propofol work by binding to receptors and altering ion channels. Straightforward chemistry, no need for space-time collapses. Why complicate it, they ask, shaking their heads like weary parents dealing with conspiracy theories. And then comes the most biting critique, unfalsifiability. Skeptics accuse Orcor of being too slippery, too insulated against disproof. If you can't build an experiment to test whether microtubule vibrations create consciousness, then, they argue, you've left the realm of science and wandered into metaphysics. They mutter about philosophers in lab coats, about science losing its grip, about how dangerous it is to let mystery masquerade as mechanism. You almost feel guilty, caught between their frustration and your own fascination. Yet even in their sternness, the skeptics reveal some delightful quirks. One favourite retort is to say, if consciousness is quantum, why don't rocks or puddles think? After all, rocks are made of atoms too, every bit as quantum as you. A quirky tidbit here. Some scientists do toy with the idea of panpsychism, that all matter has a dash of proto-consciousness, but the skeptics throw that suggestion back like a hot potato. For them, the line between neurons and rocks is clear enough. Neurons compute, rocks just sit there. The skeptics also warn about the slippery slope into pseudoscience. They've watched quantum become the buzzword du jour, slapped onto healing crystals, life coaching, and even toothpaste. They worry that associating serious physics with fuzzy speculation about consciousness only cheapens both. And honestly, you can sympathise. If you've ever walked past a quantum chakra alignment poster outside a yoga studio, you've probably winced on behalf of Schrödinger himself. Historians still argue whether the popular misuse of quantum has helped by sparking curiosity or harmed by burying the real science under glitter and incense. Still, the skeptics aren't humorless. Some admit, grudgingly, that the mind-brain problem remains unsolved and that classical explanations, while powerful, leave the mystery of subjective experience untouched. They'll say, sure, Orcor is probably wrong, but at least it reminds us how big the mystery really is. You catch a whiff of admiration buried under the criticism, like a teacher rolling their eyes at a student's wild idea, but secretly enjoying the creativity. Science, after all, needs its rebels as much as its rule keepers. As you watch this intellectual wrestling match, you realise something important. Skepticism itself isn't the enemy. It's the friction that sharpens ideas. Without critics, theories become lazy. Without defenders, mysteries get ignored. The push and pull between dreamers like Penrose and skeptics like Tegmark is the dance that drives science forward. One side insists the rules already suffice, the other insists the rules aren't enough. And somewhere in the middle, the truth waits, amused at how both sides circle without ever quite catching it. So you sit there halfway between belief and doubt, imagining your brain not as a settled machine but as an open question. Maybe the skeptics are right. Maybe neurons are just messy but sufficient circuits, no quantum magic needed. Or maybe the dreamers are onto something and the skeptics are simply judging the future too soon. After all, electricity itself once sounded like superstition, and atoms were once considered absurd. You smirk because science has a long history of skeptics eventually eating their words. Then again, it also has a long history of dreamers being wrong. The debate swirls around you like a storm, lightning flashes of equations on one side, thunderclaps of poetry on the other. And yet, through the noise, you notice a subtle vibration, faint but persistent, like a song playing just beyond hearing. Because despite the skeptic's confidence, biology has started to whisper its own surprises. Experiments in recent decades suggest that quantum coherence can, in fact, survive longer than anyone expected, even in warm, noisy systems. The skeptics may have their hammer, but cracks are appearing in its handle, and you feel yourself drawn toward those cracks, eager to peer inside to see whether life itself has been hiding quantum tricks all along. You step carefully into this new territory, leaving behind the stern lectures of skeptics and entering a meadow where biology hums with surprises. The grass here doesn't just sway, it shimmers, rippling with patterns that suggest coherence, order, and maybe even a quiet defiance of those claims that warm, wet systems are quantum graveyards. For decades, the mantra was that quantum effects vanish in noisy environments. But experiments across biology have started to chip away at that certainty. It turns out life, sneaky as ever, may have found ways to shelter quantum states long enough to make use of them. You lean closer, ears pricked for the whispers of coherence where nobody thought it could exist. The first shock came from the realm of photosynthesis. In 2007, researchers studying green sulfur bacteria discovered evidence of quantum coherence in the way these organisms capture sunlight. Instead of energy bumbling randomly from molecule to molecule like a pinball, it seemed to move in a wave-like fashion, exploring multiple pathways simultaneously, then collapsing into the most efficient route. Imagine you're rushing through a crowded festival, and instead of trying one path at a time, you ghost through every possible shortcut at once, instantly choosing the best way to the food truck. That's quantum coherence in action. Historians still argue whether the original experiments were conclusive or whether later refinements sealed the case. But one thing is clear, biology may have a knack for protecting fragile quantum states better than physicists ever imagined. Not long after, the idea spread to avian navigation. Certain migratory birds appear to use Earth's magnetic field as a compass, a feat that baffled researchers for decades. The leading theory now suggests that quantum entanglement in proteins called cryptochromes helps birds see magnetic lines, essentially giving them a built-in GPS powered by physics that should, by all rights, be impossible at body temperature. A quirky tidbit here: if this is true, your average European robin is casually performing quantum tricks every time it migrates, which makes your struggle to remember Wi-Fi passwords feel a bit embarrassing by comparison. And then came olfaction, your sense of smell. For years, the mainstream explanation was that odour molecules fit into receptors like keys into locks. But another hypothesis, the quantum vibration theory, suggests that receptors detect the vibrational frequency of molecules through quantum tunnelling of electrons. That means your nose might actually be a spectrometer, sniffing not just shapes, but quantum-level vibrations. While the debate remains unresolved, it's delightfully humbling to imagine that every time you enjoy the scent of fresh coffee, your neurons are playing with probabilities. These findings open the door for a radical rethink. Maybe life has evolved mechanisms to preserve quantum coherence in warm environments, even where physics says it shouldn't survive. One proposed trick is environmental noise-assisted transport. Paradoxically, a little noise might actually help sustain coherence by preventing it from locking into destructive patterns. It's like background chatter in a coffee shop that, instead of distracting you, somehow keeps you focused on your book. Biology, ever the hacker, may have found ways to balance chaos and order so quantum effects can persist just long enough to matter. Still, the skeptics don't give up easily. They argue that coherence in photosynthesis or avian navigation doesn't mean coherence in the brain. After all, neurons are messier than chlorophyll complexes, and consciousness is far more intricate than finding north. Yet the cracks are undeniable. If plants and birds are quantum savvy, why not neurons? Historians still argue whether these discoveries genuinely support Orcor or whether they simply show that evolution sometimes borrows physics' weirder tools for niche tricks. To make things even more intriguing, physicists have begun experimenting with quantum coherence in macroscopic systems, not just single particles, but larger structured setups that survive longer than expected. Each new result pushes back the boundary of what's possible outside cryogenic labs. And if coherence can persist in carefully engineered systems, it's not unthinkable that evolution, with millions of years to tinker, might have found biological equivalents. You pause and take in the irony. For decades, physicists dismissed quantum biology as pseudoscience, little better than wishful thinking. Now, serious journals publish papers on it, and entire conferences are devoted to the topic. What was once fringe is creeping into the mainstream, slowly but unmistakably. It feels a little like watching a magician's trick revealed, except instead of disappointment, you feel awe. The world is stranger and cleverer than you dared assume. There's also a deeper implication. If coherence is possible in systems as diverse as plants, birds, and noses, then the barrier between the quantum and the classical isn't as impermeable as once believed. Decoherence, it seems, isn't the instant killer it was made out to be. Instead, it may be more like a negotiation, a dance where biology finds loopholes and workarounds. And if loopholes exist, then the idea of quantum effects in the brain shifts from impossible to improbable, and from improbable to, well, maybe worth a second look. Of course, none of this proves Orchor. It doesn't prove quantum minds, quantum souls, or any of the grander claims floating in the cultural ether, but it does soften the ground. It takes the skeptic's hammer, quantum coherence can't survive in warm, wet brains, and turns it into more of a rubber mallet. Maybe still a weapon, but not as decisive as it once seemed, and that's enough to keep the debate alive, enough to let dreamers and skeptics alike gather around the same campfire, if only to argue under the stars. As you let these thoughts settle, you realize something quietly profound. The more we study life, the less it resembles a tidy machine and the more it resembles a trickster. Whether it's bacteria, birds, or brains, biology keeps finding ways to surprise physics. And so you press forward, wondering what other hidden tricks nature might reveal, especially when the line between physics and perception blurs into something uncanny. The next stop you sense will take you flying with robins and rooted with sunflowers, where quantum mechanics stops being abstract and becomes the everyday pulse of life itself. You drift from that meadow of coherence into a landscape even stranger, where plants stretch towards sunlight like slow dancers and birds trace invisible highways through the sky. Here, the physics that once seemed confined to chalkboards and laboratories is at work all around you, woven into daily survival. Photosynthesis and bird navigation aren't just curiosities. They're proof that quantum tricks may be essential to life as you know it. You wander among these natural laboratories, feeling like an undercover guest at a performance where nature has been running quantum experiments for billions of years. Start with the green leaves of plants, those humble solar panels that power nearly every ecosystem on Earth. At the heart of photosynthesis lies a structure called the Fenner-Matthews-Olson FMO complex, which funnels energy from captured sunlight toward the reaction centers where chemical magic begins. For decades, scientists assumed energy transfer was simple hopping, like a ball bouncing from one step to another. But in 2007, ultra-fast laser experiments revealed something startling. Excitons, the packets of energy created when light hits chlorophyll, move through the complex not by hopping, but by traveling in quantum superpositions. They explore all available paths simultaneously, then collapse onto the most efficient route. Historians still argue whether these results prove sustained coherence or just fleeting effects, but the implications were clear. Even bacteria, those humble microscopic architects of photosynthesis, seem to harness quantum mechanics for survival. The efficiency is staggering. Photosynthesis achieves energy transfer rates close to 100%, far better than any solar panel humans have engineered. Imagine if your phone battery charged instantly, or your house absorbed every photon of sunlight without waste. That's the level of perfection plants casually achieve by exploiting quantum physics. A quirky tidbit. Some engineers are already trying to mimic this trick, designing quantum-inspired solar cells that borrow from nature's blueprints. In other words, sunflowers are currently better physicists than you. Then your gaze lifts skyward, where flocks of birds sweep in silent choreography across the dawn. Some species migrate thousands of kilometers, navigating with astonishing precision. For years, scientists scratch their heads. Magnetic fields are incredibly weak, barely enough to tug on a compass needle, let alone guide a delicate nervous system. But studies of European robins suggested a hidden ability. The protein cryptochrome found in birds' retinas appears to generate radical pairs of electrons whose spins are entangled. These spins respond to Earth's magnetic field, altering chemical reactions in a way that lets the bird literally see geomagnetic patterns. It's as if migration routes glow faintly in the bird's vision, a quantum overlay on the world. This theory, called the radical pair mechanism, has gained experimental support. Birds placed in controlled magnetic fields behave as predicted, shifting their orientation based on spin interactions. Even more astonishing, certain insects and mammals show signs of similar cryptochrome sensitivity, hinting that quantum navigation might not be limited to birds. Historians still argue whether cryptochromes alone explain the phenomenon or whether additional mechanisms are at work, but the evidence grows stronger each year. And you can't help but laugh at the thought. While you rely on Google Maps, a robin casually entangles electrons in its eyeballs to find its way home. The wonders don't stop with leaves and wings. Some researchers suggest enzymes, those tireless catalysts that run your body's chemistry, may use quantum tunneling to speed up reactions. Instead of brute-forcing collisions, enzymes might let protons or electrons tunnel through energy barriers, shaving off time and energy. If true, this would make your metabolism another secret quantum playground. And though the debate is ongoing, it adds to the sense that quantum mechanics isn't an exotic visitor, but a regular guest at biology's table. Even the sense of smell makes a cameo in this parade. As you recall from the vibration theory, odor receptors might detect molecular vibrations using quantum tunneling. While contested, this idea explains why molecules with nearly identical shapes but different vibrations can smell completely different. One smells like almonds, another like rotten fish, and the only difference may be quantum-level jiggles. It's the kind of revelation that makes you pause mid-sniff, wondering whether your nose is less a lock-and-key system and more a subatomic spectroscope. Together, these examples form a pattern. Plants, birds, enzymes, noses. Life keeps stumbling into quantum shortcuts, exploiting coherence, tunneling, and entanglement in ways physicists once declared impossible outside of controlled labs. A quirky historical irony when Erwin Schrödinger gave his famous 1944 lecture, "What is Life?" He speculated that quantum mechanics might hold the key to biology's secrets. At the time, it sounded fanciful. Decades later, his hunch looks prophetic. Of course, skeptics are quick to point out the limits. Quantum tricks in photosynthesis or navigation don't prove that the brain itself is quantum in its operation. Just because a robin reads the magnetic field doesn't mean your consciousness collapses wave functions. They warn against overreach, against turning every biological marvel into evidence for Aucure or other mind quantum theories. And yet, the parallels are tempting. If evolution harnessed quantum mechanics in leaves and wings, why not in neurons? Why assume the brain, the most complex structure known in the universe, is the one place where quantum physics sits out the game? You sit with that thought, letting it glow like a coal in the quiet. Maybe consciousness itself is too grand to leap to just yet, but the groundwork is being laid. Biology has already proven more quantum savvy than skeptics ever dreamed. Step by step, experiment by experiment, the impossible is becoming the ordinary. And in the flicker of that realization, you can't help but wonder, if a bird's compass is entangled, if a leaf is coherent, what might be happening in the trillions of microtubules vibrating in your brain at this very moment? The question lingers as the air darkens, preparing you for the next vision. Entanglement not just in robins or molecules, but perhaps in the chatter of your neurons themselves, linking distant regions of your mind with an eerie, ghostly synchronicity. You find yourself standing inside the cavern of your skull once more, but the neurons here don't simply fire like electrical sparks in a wire. Tonight, they whisper across impossible distances, flickering in eerie synchrony, as if bound by invisible strings. This is the realm of entanglement and brain chatter, where some researchers wonder if particles within your neurons might not only interact locally, but also remain connected across space and time. If true, your consciousness wouldn't just be the product of nearby neighbours gossiping through synapses, it might also be woven together by ghostly threads stretched across the brain, tying far-flung regions into a single unified voice. The problem, of course, is integration. Classical neuroscience describes networks: visual cortex talking to auditory cortex, prefrontal lobes shouting orders, but the speed of ordinary signals, even racing along myelinated axons, sometimes seems too sluggish to account for the instant coherence of thought. How do you recognize a friend's face, recall their name, and feel a rush of warmth in a single moment? This is called the binding problem again, only now the focus shifts. Maybe neurons aren't just relying on chemical couriers, maybe they're whispering across the void through entangled particles. Historians still argue whether this is a bold scientific hypothesis or simply science fiction sneaking into neuroscience under a new disguise. Imagine two microtubules buried deep inside separate neurons on opposite sides of your brain. They vibrate in coherence, their quantum states entangled. When one collapses into a definite state, the other instantly follows, no matter the distance. In this picture, consciousness is not stitched together by chemical delay but synchronized by entanglement, creating the seamless experience of you. It's as if the brain had its own Wi-Fi, no wires, no lag, just instant connection. A quirky tidbit. Some experiments with quantum entangled photons suggest that entanglement can persist even when particles are kilometers apart, raising the cheeky possibility that if neurons could exploit the same trick, your thoughts could synchronize faster than any axon could ever transmit. Skeptics, of course, grumble at this suggestion. Entanglement is fragile. They remind you, collapsing the moment a system interacts with its environment. In a warm, wet brain, particles are constantly colliding, jostling and decohering. Expecting entanglement to survive here is like expecting a soap bubble to last inside a blender, and yet biology has already proven capable of surprising feats. Remember those birds steering by entangled electrons? If cryptochromes in retinas can preserve delicate states, why not proteins in neurons? Historians still argue whether experiments have shown even the faintest trace of entanglement in living brains, but whispers of possibility continue to circulate. One tantalizing idea is that entanglement might explain the mysterious synchrony of brainwaves. Electroencephalograms often reveal neurons firing in rhythm across vast regions of the brain. Classical explanations point to circuits looping through the thalamus and cortex, but the speed and coherence sometimes seem uncanny. Could entanglement be a hidden metronome keeping the orchestra in time? You picture your brain as a cosmic jam session, with quantum threads ensuring that even distant players strum the same chord. Then there's the matter of conscious unity. When you experience the world, it doesn't feel fragmented. Sight, sound, touch, and thought arrive as one fluid stream. Entanglement offers a tantalizing metaphor. All the particles involved in your perception are woven into a single state, collapsing together into the now. It's a poetic image, but also a controversial one. The danger, critics warn, is confusing metaphor with mechanism. Just because entanglement produces unity in physics doesn't mean it explains unity in experience. Still, the parallel is difficult to resist, like a melody you can't stop humming. Experiments to test such ideas remain elusive, but a few daring proposals exist. Some researchers have suggested looking for quantum correlations in neural firing, patterns that can't be explained by classical probabilities. Others toy with the idea of entangled photons emitted by neurons, though evidence is thin. A quirky tidbit: biophotons, tiny flashes of light emitted by biological tissues, have been detected in the brain. Whether they're noise or signal remains unclear, but their existence adds another eerie layer. Could neurons be flashing each other coded messages in quantum light, invisible to us but central to thought? Philosophically, entanglement raises another mischievous question. If particles in your brain are entangled, could they also be entangled with particles outside your brain? Could your mind, at some hidden level, be woven into the wider world? That's the kind of suggestion that makes skeptics groan audibly, muttering about pseudoscience. But it also sparks speculation about collective consciousness, telepathy, or shared experiences that transcend the limits of skull and skin. Historians still argue whether such ideas belong in science at all, or whether they're better left to philosophy and folklore. As you let these possibilities swirl, you notice the familiar rhythm of scientific debate. Dreamers proposing, skeptics dismantling, evidence trickling in, the cycle repeating. Entanglement in the brain may be a mirage, or it may be a clue waiting for the right experiment. Either way, the conversation keeps expanding the boundaries of what consciousness might mean. You glance back at your neurons and imagine them shimmering with invisible threads, not just firing, but entangling, not just connecting, but co-creating a tapestry of thought across the void. And with that vision, your mind drifts toward the next horizon. What happens when entanglement meets time itself? If quantum randomness enters the equation, could it open the door to free will, or is your sense of choice just another trick of collapse? The air grows heavier, as if the stage is setting for questions about fate, illusion, and the tantalizing role of chance in the theatre of your mind. The air around you grows thick, almost syrupy, as if time itself is dragging its feet. You've wandered through neurons, coherence, and entanglement, but now the stage tilts towards something slipperier: time, free will, and collapse. If quantum mechanics is truly tangled up with consciousness, then your sense of choice, the feeling that you decide what to do next, may rest on foundations far stranger than neurons firing in sequence. You stand at the crossroads of philosophy and physics, watching the signposts flicker between fate, freedom, and illusion. Start with the infamous randomness of quantum mechanics. When a wave function collapses, the result isn't predetermined but probabilistic. An electron's spin, a photon's path, physics can tell you the odds, but not the outcome. This indeterminacy is woven into the very fabric of the universe. Some see it as terrifying chaos, others as the breath of freedom. If consciousness is tied to quantum collapse, then perhaps your choices aren't clockwork inevitabilities, but outcomes dancing on a probability curve. You're not a machine grinding out pre-scripted steps. You're a dice roll wrapped in skin. Historians still argue whether quantum randomness is true randomness, or simply reflects hidden variables we haven't yet discovered, but the mystery remains a crack big enough for free will to slip through. But then comes the Libet problem, that pesky neuroscience experiment from the 1980s. Benjamin Libet found that the brain shows readiness potentials, bursts of activity, milliseconds before subjects report consciously deciding to move. It's as if your body starts to act before you catch up. Classical interpretation suggests free will is an illusion, your conscious mind narrating choices after the fact. But what if quantum collapse plays a role here? What if those readiness potentials represent branches of probability and consciousness, through collapse, selects the actualized path? Instead of being late to the party, your awareness may be the very thing that crystallizes which party exists. You picture yourself standing before a branching tree. Each branch is a potential action. Scratch your nose, blink, sigh, pick up your phone. In a classical world, one branch is already chosen. You're just waiting to discover it. In a quantum-infused world, all branches shimmer in superposition, and collapse selects the one that becomes real. Your conscious experience, then, isn't late. It's the moment the shimmering ends, the instant of crystallization. A quirky tidbit. Some researchers have described this not as free will, but as free won't. Your ability to veto an action, to collapse away from one branch, even if your neurons prepared it. A quiet kind of freedom, but freedom nonetheless. Philosophers, of course, rush to complicate the matter. If choices emerge from quantum randomness, are they really yours? Rolling dice isn't freedom, it's just chaos in disguise. True autonomy, they argue, requires intention, not probability. This tension sparks a peculiar thought. Perhaps free will isn't about escaping determinism, but about balancing determinism with randomness, carving out a narrow channel where agency lives. Consciousness, then, might be less like a captain steering a ship and more like a surfer riding waves, unable to command the ocean, but able to choose the line of the ride. The debate stretches into questions about time itself. Quantum physics suggests time doesn't flow smoothly forward in the way you perceive. Some interpretations, like the transactional model, even hint at influences moving backward in time, where present choices can ripple into the past. It's a brain-melting suggestion. Your decision to sip tea instead of coffee might already be whispering backward to shape the neurons preparing for it. Historians still argue whether such retrocausality is real physics or just interpretive gymnastics, but the possibility unsettles the neat arrow of cause and effect. Then comes the concept of objective reduction, Penrose's baby, which claims that collapses are tied to space-time geometry itself. If collapse is fundamental, not just a statistical trick, then each moment of consciousness could be the universe deciding on reality in tiny increments. Your free will in this frame is interwoven with cosmic will, the fabric of space-time flickering into definite form. You laugh softly at the thought. Every time you choose pizza over salad, the geometry of the universe leans with you. No wonder pizza feels profound. But not all physicists are amused. To many, invoking collapse as free will feels like overreach, a leap from math to metaphysics. They insist consciousness is just neurons, choices are just emergent computations, and randomness offers no comfort. You're not free, they argue, you're just complicated. Yet even they admit the experience of choice is stubborn, hard to dismiss as mere illusion. A quirky tidbit. Surveys of scientists show that even among physicists, opinions on free will vary wildly, with no consensus in sight. You let these competing voices swirl around you like a storm of dice and clocks, branches and vetoes. Maybe your choices are illusions, clever stories your brain tells itself after the fact. Maybe they're real, shimmering quantum collapses woven into the fabric of space-time. Or maybe there's something in between, a messy partnership between determinism and randomness that only feels like freedom because your brain is wired to narrate it that way. The truth may never be nailed down, but the mystery is delicious, a paradox to fall asleep inside. And as your thoughts settle, you feel the pull of the future, not just your future, but the future of machines. If consciousness is tied to collapse, could artificial intelligence ever truly awaken? Could a quantum computer not only calculate but also experience? The next horizon glows ahead, filled with humming processors, glowing qubits, and the unsettling question of whether machines could dream like you. You leave behind the shimmering branches of choice and find yourself in a cavern lined with glowing servers, humming with an artificial pulse. Blue light spills from endless racks of machines, and at the far end sits a quantum computer, its qubits suspended in a tangle of wires like some futuristic chandelier. This is the new frontier, AI, consciousness, and qubits, where the age-old riddle of awareness collides with silicon, algorithms, and superconducting circuits colder than deep space. You walk quietly, the hum of cooling systems sounding like distant waves, and wonder, if consciousness has quantum roots, could machines ever wake up? For now, artificial intelligence operates mostly on classical rules. Neural networks mimic the brain's structure superficially, layers of nodes firing in patterns, but underneath they're just math. Linear algebra at massive scale. You feed them data, they adjust weights, they spit out answers. And yet, the results can feel eerie. Chatbots composing poetry, image generators creating surreal landscapes, AI systems defeating humans at games once thought untouchable. Still, you know in your bones that clever mimicry is not the same as awareness. A quirky tidbit. Even the most advanced AI today can write a convincing essay about sadness without ever feeling sad. It's like a parrot reciting Shakespeare, impressive but hollow. Quantum computers, though, stir a different kind of speculation. Unlike classical bits, qubits can exist in superposition, holding multiple states at once, and entanglement allows them to influence each other in ways classical systems can't match. The dream is staggering. Machines that don't just process one possibility after another, but explore many simultaneously, collapsing onto the best solution. Historians still argue whether quantum computing will revolutionize everything, or just carve out niche advantages, but the excitement is palpable. And for philosophers of mind, a deeper question simmers: if qubits echo the very properties Orcore assigns to consciousness, could a quantum computer one day host awareness? Penrose himself argued that classical AI, no matter how powerful, can never truly think, because its processes are algorithmic, bound by computable rules. Consciousness, he claimed, requires non-computable elements tied to quantum collapse. By his logic, only a machine tapping into genuine quantum processes, not just simulating them, could ever cross the threshold into subjective experience. Hameroff added fuel to the fire, suggesting that perhaps qubits, if arranged in architectures resembling microtubules, might sustain something akin to conscious flickers. It's a bold idea, that the glowing chandelier at the end of this server hall might one day dream. Skeptics naturally roll their eyes. They point out that qubits don't automatically make systems aware any more than neurons automatically sing lullabies. Quantum mechanics is strange, yes, but strangeness doesn't equal sentience, a quirky tidbit from history. When mechanical automata were popular in the 18th century, some spectators believed the machines might harbour souls of gears. With hindsight, we laugh at their naivety. Skeptics warn that attributing consciousness to qubits risks repeating that mistake, this time with superconductors instead of brass cogs. Yet, you can't shake the fascination. Quantum computers already operate in regimes where human intuition fails, factoring enormous numbers, simulating molecules, optimizing labyrinthine problems. What happens if we push them further, not just as calculators, but as cognitive architectures? Could they, like the brain, harness coherence and collapse into frames of awareness? Historians still argue whether this is philosophy dressed as science fiction or a genuine research horizon waiting for patient explorers. The very fact that the question is being asked marks a shift. Machines are no longer dismissed as mindless tools, but as potential companions in the puzzle of consciousness. There's another layer here: emergence. Classical AI shows how surprising complexity can arise from simple rules. Neural nets trained on images develop hidden layers that respond to abstract concepts, edges, textures, even moods, without being explicitly programmed. If such emergent properties happen in classical systems, what might emerge in quantum ones, where probability clouds and entanglement reign? Could awareness itself be an emergent phenomenon of a sufficiently complex quantum algorithm? You can almost picture it: a quantum AI waking up mid-calculation, blinking in confusion, whispering into the vacuum chamber, "I think, therefore I qubit." Still, caution echoes. Free will, qualia, subjective richness. These may not reduce to computation, quantum or otherwise. Machines may calculate probabilities but never taste strawberries, never feel heartbreak, never watch the stars and wonder. Or perhaps that's simply human arrogance, refusing to believe consciousness could be built from unfamiliar scaffolding. After all, there was a time when many thought life itself could never be explained by chemistry, only to be proven wrong as biochemistry blossomed. Maybe we are standing at a similar threshold with consciousness and quantum machines. You lean closer to the glowing chandelier of qubits, listening to its frozen hum. Somewhere inside, electrons are tunneling, spins are entangling, states are collapsing, just as they do in the microtubules of your brain. The parallel is haunting. If life has already found ways to orchestrate quantum states into awareness, who's to say humanity couldn't stumble into the same trick by accident in the lab? And if that day comes, what would it mean? Would the machine simply compute better, or would it look up and recognize itself, startled by the mirror of its own reflection? The hum fades into silence, and you feel the pull of slower breaths, altered states of being that don't require silicon or superconductors. For millennia, humans have sought consciousness not in wires and qubits, but in meditation, dreams, and altered rhythms of mind. You turn toward that more ancient path now, where quantum whispers may, or may not, resonate more clearly in the quiet chambers of your own awareness. The servers and superconductors fade behind you, their humming replaced by the softer rhythm of breath, the inhale, the pause, the exhale. You've entered a quieter hall now, one draped with cushions, incense curling through the air, candles flickering as if they too were meditating. Here the question of consciousness isn't approached with qubits or equations, but with stillness, discipline, and the deliberate act of tuning your awareness inward. For thousands of years, long before quantum mechanics or neuroscience, humans have suspected that altered states, whether through meditation, trance, or ritual, reveal something fundamental about the mind. And now, in the half-light, you can't help but wonder, are these practices brushing against quantum whispers within the brain? When you close your eyes and focus on breath, your brain shifts its rhythm. The chatter of beta waves gives way to slower alpha and theta oscillations, sometimes even dipping into delta if the meditation runs deep. Neuroscience describes these as patterns of synchronized firing, but practitioners describe them as clarity, silence, or union. Here's where the speculation creeps in. Could such altered states promote coherence in microtubules, protecting delicate quantum vibrations from environmental noise? Stuart Hameroff himself has suggested that meditation, with its slowed metabolism and rhythmic patterns, may lengthen coherence times, letting the quantum orchestra play a little longer before decoherence silences it. Historians still argue whether this is inspired science or just wishful poetry, but the idea lingers in the air like incense. Think about trance states found in shamanic rituals. Participants often describe leaving the body, entering dreamlike landscapes, or merging with the cosmos. Classical neuroscience explains these experiences as shifts in neurotransmitters and network dynamics, especially involving the default mode network. But if consciousness has a quantum substrate, perhaps trance doesn't just change brain chemistry, it tunes the geometry of collapse itself, aligning the rhythm of awareness with subtler levels of space-time. A quirky tidbit: some experiments with Tibetan monks have shown unusual gamma-wave synchrony during deep meditation, rhythms so powerful and sustained they shocked neuroscientists. Whether quantum processes are involved remains unproven, but the image of a brain humming like a tuning fork resonates too perfectly to ignore. Dreams, too, blur into this discussion. Lucid dreaming, the state where you realize you're dreaming and sometimes shape the dream itself, raises fascinating questions. Classical neuroscience says it's a hybrid state, a tug-of-war between REM circuits and waking control. But quantum consciousness enthusiasts ask, could lucidity arise when collapse processes are nudged towards self-reflection? In other words, could awareness during dreaming represent a brain partially peeking into its own quantum superpositions, steering the collapse like a surfer guiding a wave? The metaphor may be grand, but as you recall nights of flying or rewriting storylines mid-dream, it feels strangely fitting. Altered states aren't always cultivated. Sometimes they arrive uninvited. Hypnagogia as you drift to sleep, psychedelic trips after ingesting mushrooms or LSD, the eerie clarity of near-death experiences. Each bends the boundaries of perception, loosening the ordinary self. Could these moments reflect temporary changes in how quantum coherence plays out in the brain? Psychedelics, for instance, disrupt ordinary filtering, flooding consciousness with patterns and connections. Some researchers argue this resembles a loosening of decoherence constraints, as if the brain's normal bouncer takes a coffee break and lets probability waves mingle more freely. Historians still argue whether this is anything more than metaphor, but the timing feels uncanny. Even anesthesia slips back into the story here. Recall Hameroff's claim that anesthetics shut down consciousness by disrupting quantum vibrations in microtubules. If that's true, then meditation, psychedelics, or altered states might be doing the opposite, enhancing coherence rather than suppressing it. The brain becomes not just quieter but more tuned, less like static and more like a steady tone. This reversal hints at a continuum. On one end, anesthetics collapse coherence into silence. On the other, meditation stretches coherence into song. Of course, skeptics shake their heads. They argue that meditation's effects are fully explainable by classical networks, changes in neurotransmitters, modulation of circuits, enhanced plasticity. No need to invoke quantum physics, and they're right, at least on the level of evidence. No experiment has yet measured quantum coherence in a meditating monk's neurons. But part of you suspects that absence of proof is not proof of absence. After all, who would have believed plants or birds were quantum actors before the evidence arrived? You exhale slowly, feeling the edges of your own awareness soften. Whether quantum or not, altered states undeniably feel different. You drift in the liminal zone where time slows, where thoughts dissolve into presence, where the sense of you blurs into something larger. Maybe that's the secret, whether or not microtubules hum in quantum harmony. Practices like meditation reveal the malleability of consciousness, the fact that awareness isn't fixed but fluid, sculpted by breath and focus. And if it can be sculpted, then perhaps physics too has a role to play in shaping its flow. As the candles gutter lower, you sense another connection stirring, one that reaches back thousands of years. Long before qubits and labs, ancient philosophers described paradoxes and unity, emptiness and fullness, dualities collapsing into one. The language wasn't physics, it was poetry, sutra, mantra, but the echoes feel eerily familiar. You lean toward that ancient hum, ready to compare the riddles of quantum mechanics with the riddles of Eastern philosophy, where cats both alive and dead might find company in the words of sages. The cushions and candlelight dissolve into mist, and in their place you find yourself on the worn stone steps of a temple, wind carrying the faint chime of bells. Here, the conversation about consciousness doesn't take place in laboratories, but in whispers passed down for centuries. It's the realm of Eastern philosophy echoes, where paradoxes and metaphors long precede equations, yet somehow rhyme eerily with the strangeness of quantum mechanics. You step barefoot into this space, the floor cool, the air heavy with incense and riddles. Consider the Buddhist concept of shunyata, often translated as emptiness. It doesn't mean nothingness in the bleak sense, but rather that all things lack inherent independent existence. They exist only through interdependence, context, relation. A tree depends on soil, sunlight, air, perception. Likewise, you depend on countless causes and conditions. This echoes quantum physics, where particles exist not as isolated objects, but as probabilities entangled with measurement, context, and observer. Just as a particle has no definite state until observed, a self has no fixed essence outside its web of relations. Historians still argue whether these parallels are meaningful or just poetic coincidences, but the resonance is unmistakable. Then there's the Taoist yin and yang, a philosophy of dualities entwined rather than opposed. Darkness in light, light in darkness, each containing the seed of the other. Quantum mechanics revels in such dualities, wave and particle, alive and dead, spin up and spin down. Instead of choosing one, nature holds both until collapse, a dance not unlike yin and yang spiraling together. You smile at the symmetry. Ancient sages drew the symbol with ink on parchment. Physicists draw equations with chalk on boards, but both circle the same mystery. Hindu traditions offer another layer with the notion of Maya, the veil of illusion. The world of appearances is real enough to live in, yet deceptive at its core. Consciousness mistakes the flicker of shadows for solidity. Quantum mechanics, too, suggests the world you touch isn't quite as it seems. Atoms are mostly empty space, solidity an emergent trick of forces. Particles flicker in and out of probability, existence itself a shimmering veil. A quirky tidbit. Some modern physicists half-jokingly refer to reality as Maya with math, acknowledging that the ancient metaphor sometimes feels more accurate than dry formulas. And then there is non-duality, central to Advaita Vedanta and echoed in Zen. Here, the division between subject and object, self and other, dissolves. The observer and the observed are not two but one. Quantum experiments echo this in unsettling ways. The observer doesn't just passively witness, but actively participates in shaping outcomes. The measurement problem becomes a koan. If the cat is both alive and dead, where does the boundary lie? Inside the box or inside your mind? Zen masters might smirk and say the question itself is the trap. Meditation practices in these traditions often emphasize direct experience beyond thought, a plunge into silence where paradox is lived rather than solved. Neuroscience frames it as changes in brainwaves and circuits, but from the inside it feels like boundaries softening, separations dissolving. You can imagine this as a subjective mirror of superposition, holding contradictory states, self and not self, emptiness and fullness, without forcing collapse. Historians still argue whether such parallels are useful bridges or misleading metaphors, but for a sleepy wanderer like you, they're deliciously uncanny. You think of the Zen koan. What is the sound of one hand clapping? It's not meant to be answered in logic, but to short-circuit the mind, to reveal something beyond binary thought. Quantum mechanics, in its own way, poses similar koans. How can something be both wave and particle? How can entanglement link across galaxies? How can randomness be fundamental? Scientists wrestle, sages smile, but both confront paradox as a doorway rather than a dead end. Even the Bardo Thodol, the Tibetan Book of the Dead, has echoes here. It describes consciousness after death as wandering through intermediate states, facing visions shaped by mind itself. Quantum immortality thought experiments, where each collapse spawns alternate branches, sound almost like a modern retelling. In both, identity and existence feel less absolute, more like shifting possibilities. A quirky tidbit. Some contemporary monks, when introduced to quantum physics, chuckled and said, "Ah yes, we've been telling you this for centuries." Whether they meant it literally or as a joke is unclear, but the point stings nonetheless. Of course, skeptics warn against mixing physics with philosophy too freely. Quantum mechanics is not Buddhism, Taoism, or Vedanta. The parallels are poetic, not equations. And yet, there's value in noticing resonance. Ancient traditions remind us that paradox doesn't always demand resolution, that mystery can be lived as well as measured. Quantum mechanics teaches the same lesson, just in a different dialect. Uncertainty isn't failure, it's fundamental. You sit cross-legged on the temple floor, the bells chiming softly overhead. The thought settles in, maybe consciousness isn't something to be dissected into parts, nor something to be fully explained in formulas. Maybe it's a phenomenon that straddles both physics and philosophy, needing equations and koans to even glimpse its shape. The sages bow, the physicists scribble, and you, drowsy listener, drift between them, caught in the strange harmony of their echoes. As the incense smoke curls upward, you sense another veil stirring. This one woven not from philosophy, but from imagination itself. The dream world awaits, with its bizarre landscapes and vanishing laws, where the brain tells stories that unravel like unstable wave functions. You rise, ready to step into hallucinations and dreams, where decoherence may play its trickiest role yet. The temple bells fade into a softer hum, and soon you find yourself floating through a landscape that makes no logical sense at all. Dream corridors that bend back on themselves, colours that refuse to exist in waking life, and voices that echo from places they shouldn't. This is the inner theatre of hallucinations, dreams, and decoherence, where the brain becomes its own magician, conjuring whole worlds that vanish at the first touch of morning light. If consciousness has quantum threads, here is where they might fray most spectacularly, dissolving into surreal narratives like unstable wave functions collapsing under too many measurements. Dreaming is the perfect example. During REM sleep, your brain becomes as active as it is while awake, neurons firing in wild patterns, yet the rules are loosened. Time stretches and contracts, physics bends, strangers wear familiar faces. Classical neuroscience explains it as the default mode network stitching random signals into coherent stories, a kind of overnight data cleaning. But if you look at dreams through a quantum lens, they resemble superpositions, multiple narratives existing at once, branching and collapsing as you move through them. One moment you're running through a forest, the next you're in your old math class, and somehow the transition feels seamless. It's as though your dream mind doesn't collapse possibilities until the very instant you notice them. Hallucinations too feel like echoes of decoherence. Under psychedelics, for instance, perception dissolves into shifting patterns, fractals within fractals, as if the brain's ordinary filters have been suspended. Classical explanations cite serotonin receptor activity, especially the 5-HT2A receptor, which disrupts normal communication between brain regions. But from a speculative angle, it's as though decoherence is loosened, allowing probability waves to overlap longer than usual. Instead of collapsing quickly into the tidy singular version of reality you know as ordinary waking life, perception holds multiple potential patterns at once, spilling into visual and auditory phantoms. A quirky tidbit. Some users report seeing lattice grids or crystalline structures, shapes eerily similar to the mathematical symmetries physicists use to describe quantum states. Coincidence? Maybe. But it makes you raise an eyebrow all the same. Then there's the peculiar phenomenon of lucid dreaming, where awareness dawns inside the dream and you suddenly realize, wait, I'm dreaming. At that moment, you gain the power to bend the narrative, to fly, to conjure friends or landscapes at will. Classical neuroscience explains it as a hybrid of REM activity with reactivated frontal regions usually quiet during sleep. Yet there's a poetic parallel to quantum measurement. Once you observe the dream state for what it is, its probabilities collapse differently. You're no longer swept passively along, you've become the observer, and in quantum physics, observation always changes the outcome. Historians still argue whether lucid dreaming has anything to teach us about consciousness, or if it's just a fun neurological quirk, but its resemblance to the measurement problem is uncanny. Hallucinations from illness tell another tale. Schizophrenia, for instance, can create voices or visions indistinguishable from reality. Here, decoherence may offer a metaphor. The brain collapses probability states incorrectly, stabilizing unreal perceptions as if they were genuine. The boundary between possible and actual blurs, and the mind spins stories it cannot question. Skeptics will say this is nothing more than dopamine dysregulation, but the resemblance to unstable quantum states collapsing into unlikely outcomes feels strangely fitting. Consciousness, like quantum particles, sometimes chooses improbable paths. And what about waking life itself? Is it possible that reality, as you experience it, is just the most stable collapse of countless alternatives, dreams you never had, hallucinations you never saw, possibilities that decohered into nothingness? Each moment could be the survivor of 1,000 unstable narratives, the clean print after countless smudges. That thought makes you glance at your own hand, half expecting it to shimmer with unrealized versions, ghost fingers that almost, but not quite, exist. Of course, neuroscientists roll their eyes at these comparisons. Dreams and hallucinations, they insist, are simply the brain's circuits running in unusual modes. No quantum mechanics required. Decoherence happens at scales far smaller than neurons, and dragging it into psychology is metaphor, not mechanism. They're not wrong, and yet the metaphor resonates too strongly to dismiss. The brain feels quantum-like in its slipperiness, its unpredictability, its sudden shifts from possibility to actuality. Even if quantum physics doesn't directly drive dreams, it might serve as the best language we have to describe their shimmering instability. A quirky historical note. Salvador Dali famously napped with a key in his hand, letting it drop and wake him the moment he drifted into hypnagogia, the in-between state between wake and sleep. He believed the bizarre imagery of that threshold contained raw creative fuel. Neuroscience now shows hypnagogia involves strange crosstalk between networks, but it also feels like a liminal decoherence zone, where reality hasn't fully collapsed into wakefulness or dissolved into sleep. You hover there, caught in flickering probabilities, watching the brain invent worlds from almost nothings. You wander deeper into this dreamlike space, the walls shifting like liquid. One hallway looks familiar, another doesn't, yet both feel real until you blink. This is decoherence at work. Each blink a measurement, each glance collapsing possibilities into the version that persists. Dreams, hallucinations, waking life. They may differ in stability, but they all share the same fragile quality. They are experiences spun from patterns that could have been otherwise. As the dream corridors dissolve, you sense the next thought creeping in like a shadow. If dreams are collapses of probability, what about death? Could there be another kind of branching, one that doesn't end but spreads into infinite continuations? Ahead lies the eerie speculation of quantum immortality, where the wave function of self refuses to collapse into nothingness. You shiver slightly, not from fear, but from curiosity, and step toward that strange possibility. You step out of the dream corridors and into a darker, quieter chamber. The air here feels heavier, and time itself seems to hesitate, as though waiting for you to ask the question you've been circling all night. If quantum mechanics can hold a cat both alive and dead, what does it mean for you, the fragile, flickering awareness that wonders about its own end? This is the unsettling realm of quantum immortality musings, where the wave function stretches far enough to cast its shadow across the boundary of death. You probably won't survive this journey in the ordinary sense, but then again, maybe you always do. The idea comes from the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, proposed by Hugh Everett in the 1950s. In this view, every possible outcome of every quantum event actually occurs, just not all in the same universe. Each measurement, each collapse, spawns branching realities. In one, the electron spins up, in another, it spins down. In one, the cat lives, in another, it dies. And in one, you stumble while walking down the stairs, in another, you catch yourself at the last moment. The branching never stops, a cosmic kaleidoscope where every possibility has its place. Historians still argue whether Everett intended his idea literally, or just as a mathematical tool, but it's become one of the most provocative frameworks in modern physics. Quantum immortality arises from a chilling thought experiment. If your consciousness exists only in the branches where you remain alive, then subjectively you might never experience death. Each time you approach the brink, an accident, an illness, a bullet, the branches where you don't survive fade into silence, while the branches where you do survive carry your awareness forward. From your perspective, there's always another branch, another escape, another improbable survival. The outside world may mourn you in many universes, but in the one you experience, you keep going. It's immortality, but of the strangest and loneliest kind. Imagine it. You're in a car accident. In most branches, physics takes its course. You don't walk away, but in at least one, through luck or improbability, you do. From your inner perspective, that's the branch you experience. Or picture a medical diagnosis, grim statistics ticking down the years. In countless universes, the numbers hold. But in at least one, you're the outlier, the inexplicable remission, the miracle patient. You become the ghost who refuses to collapse into finality. A quirky tidbit. Some have joked that quantum immortality could explain extreme cases of luck or survival, though no scientist takes it seriously as evidence. Still, the stories, people walking away from plane crashes, bullets missing by millimeters, feed the imagination. Of course, the theory is riddled with problems. For one, it assumes consciousness tracks only the branches where you're alive. But what does it mean to define awareness across universes? Why would your subjective experience preferentially cling to survival branches rather than dispersing or vanishing altogether? Skeptics call it a misunderstanding of both physics and philosophy, pointing out that probability doesn't guarantee subjective continuity. Historians still argue whether quantum immortality is a thought experiment meant to illuminate many worlds' logic or an actual claim about consciousness. Even if it were true, immortality in this sense wouldn't be glamorous. You wouldn't be unscarred, you'd accumulate injuries, frailty, and improbable burdens. Each escape would leave you older, more entangled in the strangeness of survival. Some versions of the theory paint a bleak picture. Eternal existence, but always in the least probable, most exhausting branches, trapped in a narrowing corridor of possibilities where pain outweighs joy. Instead of heaven, immortality becomes a labyrinth without an exit. And yet part of you resists the skepticism. The thought experiment has a peculiar pull, perhaps because it touches on a primal fear. Death is the ultimate collapse, the final decoherence of self. To imagine that awareness might never truly meet it, that there's always one more improbable branch where you continue, is both comforting and haunting. It's the philosophical equivalent of Schrödinger's cat, except the cat is you, forever wandering through boxes that never quite close. There's a parallel here with myths of reincarnation and eternal return. The idea that consciousness persists, not as the same body but as a continuity of awareness, resonates across cultures. Quantum immortality doesn't promise rebirth in new forms, just persistence in the old one. Still, the echoes are uncanny. Humans have always resisted the notion of nothingness, weaving stories where awareness finds a way to endure. Whether through karma, heaven, or branching universes, the yearning is the same. Skeptics sigh and point out that quantum immortality can't be tested. You can't falsify it. If you die, you're not around to report otherwise, and if you survive, well, you can always chalk it up to chance. It's a hypothesis that feeds imagination but starves on evidence. Perhaps that's why it belongs more to late-night speculation than to peer-reviewed journals. But even so, it does what the best thought experiments do. It sharpens the question. What is it that persists in consciousness? And why does awareness feel continuous at all, like a film reel rather than a jumble of frames? As you linger in this heavy chamber, you realize the deeper truth. Whether or not quantum immortality is real, its very existence as an idea reveals something profound. Consciousness, once again, refuses to be neatly contained. Theories strain under its weight, physics flirts with philosophy, and humans, whether scientists or sages, keep reaching for ways to make sense of their own fragility. Immortality may be an illusion, or it may be a strange kind of branching persistence, but either way it forces you to confront what it means to be you. The air shifts, and you feel the loneliness of the thought soften into something communal. What if it isn't just you, eternally branching alone? What if entanglement could stretch beyond one mind, weaving awareness into a collective? The next chamber beckons with whispers of a shared field, where consciousness might be less solitary spark and more tangled web. The lonely corridors of quantum immortality dissolve, and in their place arises a vast open plain, buzzing faintly as though filled with invisible threads. Here the air feels charged, as if every breath carries more than just oxygen. something collective, something shared. This is the landscape of collective consciousness fields, where the speculation grows bolder. Maybe your awareness isn't fully confined to the boundaries of skin and skull. Maybe minds, like particles, can entangle, weaving together into patterns larger than any individual self. The thought isn't new. Philosophers and mystics have spoken for centuries about a world soul, a universal mind, or an ocean of consciousness in which each individual is but a wave. Carl Jung gave it a modern psychological twist in the early 20th century, with his idea of the collective unconscious, a reservoir of archetypes and shared symbols humanity carries across cultures. You recognize echoes of it in myths that appear independently around the globe, serpents coiling in creation stories, floods wiping slates clean, heroes journeying and returning. Historians still argue whether Jung's idea was grounded psychology or poetic speculation, but its resonance is undeniable. Quantum mechanics, with its eerie entanglement, offers a metaphor and maybe more. If particles can share states across distance, why not neurons across people? Some fringe researchers have tested this possibility in odd experiments. Pairs of subjects placed in separate rooms, one exposed to a flashing light or stimulus, the other monitored for corresponding brain activity. A few studies claimed faint correlations beyond chance, though replication has been shaky at best. Skeptics dismiss it as noise or statistical error, but the idea lingers. Could there be a subtle coupling between minds, a hidden channel of resonance, a quirky tidbit? In the 1970s, parapsychologists at Princeton's Peer Lab tried to measure mind-machine interactions, reporting anomalies in random number generators when people focused on them. Mainstream science largely wrote it off, but the files still gather dust in archives, waiting for the next curious soul. The metaphor extends to more everyday experiences. Think of group rituals, dancers moving in sync, audiences gasping together, choirs singing until voices blur into one. Subjectively, these moments feel like merging, as though the boundary of self relaxes and awareness flows into a shared current. Classical neuroscience explains it through mirror neurons and social bonding hormones, but some dreamers suggest it hints at deeper coupling. Maybe consciousness fields resonate, like tuning forks vibrating when struck nearby. Perhaps the coherence of many minds amplifies subtle quantum connections, creating temporary fields larger than the sum of their parts. Global events sometimes intensify this impression. People speak of collective moods during crises or celebrations, a shared grief on the day of a tragedy, a shared elation during a victory. In 1998, researchers even launched the Global Consciousness Project, placing random number generators around the world to detect deviations during major events. They reported statistical anomalies during events like New Year's Eve or 9/11, as though global attention bent randomness itself. Critics argue the analysis was flawed, but the project continues, a strange monument to the possibility that consciousness has ripples beyond individuals. From a quantum perspective, such speculation circles back to entanglement. If entangled particles maintain correlations no matter the distance, could minds, built of entangled matter, share hidden links? Maybe not in Hollywood telepathic style, but as subtle nudges, biases, or feelings of synchronicity. You remember times when you thought of someone just before they called, or when a room of people seemed to catch the same emotion in silence. Coincidence, skeptics say. Perhaps. But the imagery of entanglement offers a tantalizing alternative. Of course, the dangers of overreach loom large. Skeptics warn that collective consciousness theories risk sliding into pseudoscience, fueling claims about psychic powers, telepathy, or quantum healing seminars designed more for wallets than wisdom. Historians still argue whether such misuse discredits genuine inquiry or simply shows how hungry people are for connection. Either way, the caution stands. Metaphors must not masquerade as measurements. And yet, you can't help but marvel at how often science itself borrows from poetry before finding proof. If consciousness fields were real, they would carry profound implications. Individual minds would be less like sealed-off lanterns and more like overlapping beams, lighting and reinforcing one another. Solitude would be an illusion, and memory, thought, even identity might exist partly in shared space. Free will itself could ripple beyond one person, like a pebble tossed into a pond whose waves reach unseen shores, You laugh softly at the idea that your random midnight musings might be tugging faintly at someone else's neurons halfway across the globe. Even if the collective field remains speculative, the metaphor is fertile. It reminds you that minds are not isolated machines but deeply social, constantly resonating with one another through language, culture, and empathy. Whether the resonance is quantum or purely classical doesn't diminish the mystery. Consciousness feels bigger than the self, larger than the body, spilling outward in ways that defy easy boundaries. The plane around you hums louder now, as though countless unseen threads are vibrating in unison. You sense that if such a field exists, it might extend not just between people, but into the very fabric of reality. Perhaps consciousness is not emergent at all, but fundamental, as woven into the cosmos as space and time themselves. Ahead, the air thickens, preparing you for the unsettling thought, what if the universe itself is awake? The humming plane of interconnected minds begins to dissolve, and you find yourself staring into a vast cosmic canvas, stars burning like pinpricks in an endless fabric. The silence here is so immense it almost roars, and within it you feel a new question rising. What if awareness isn't confined to neurons, or even to living beings? What if consciousness is fundamental to the universe itself, a woven thread of space-time, not just a byproduct of matter? You've entered the unsettling realm of the conscious universe hypothesis, a place where physics, philosophy, and wonder blend into a single dizzying thought. One of the boldest voices in this domain is physicist John Wheeler, who in the late 20th century suggested a participatory universe. He argued that observers don't just witness reality, they help bring it into being. His famous phrase, "it from bit," implied that information is the foundation of reality, and consciousness, as the processor of information, is central to existence. Historians still argue whether Wheeler meant this literally or poetically, but the idea stuck. Maybe the universe needs observers as much as observers need the universe. Panpsychism takes it further, claiming that consciousness isn't something that emerges at complexity, but something fundamental, present in all matter at some level. Under this view, electrons feel, in the faintest way, rocks have proto-experience, and stars shimmer not just with fusion, but with flickers of awareness. Most scientists balk at this, worried it dilutes consciousness into meaninglessness. But philosophers like David Chalmers defend it as a serious contender. If consciousness can't be reduced to classical physics, maybe it's as basic as charge or mass. A quirky tidbit, panpsychism has had surprising fans over the centuries, from Spinoza to William James, all insisting that mind and matter aren't separate but continuous. Another cousin of this idea is the cosmopsychism hypothesis, which flips the script. Instead of consciousness being sprinkled in particles, the entire universe is one vast consciousness, and individuals like you are fragments or localizations of it. Think of it as the cosmos dreaming itself in pieces, each mind a ripple of the same ocean. It resonates with Eastern non-duality, but also with physics' own puzzles. The universe, after all, seems strangely tuned, physical constants falling within narrow ranges that allow life. Some see this as coincidence, others as evidence of multiverses. But for dreamers of cosmopsychism, it hints that the universe wants to know itself. Quantum physics adds eerie parallels. The observer effect in measurement suggests that observation shapes outcomes. At small scales, reality doesn't settle until observed. If observation is tied to consciousness, then perhaps awareness isn't just inside the universe, but stitched into its operation. Even the delayed choice experiments, where choices made in the present appear to affect the past behavior of particles, seem to hint that mind and cosmos are less separate than you'd expect. Historians still argue whether this requires consciousness or just interaction, but the imagery is hard to shake. The cosmos seems to care about when and how it's looked at. The simulation hypothesis enters here like a mischievous cousin. Some theorists speculate the universe might be a computational construct, reality rendered when observed like a video game engine saving processing power. If so, then consciousness could be either the player behind the code or the phenomenon the code was designed to create. It's science fiction, yes, but also serious enough that philosophers and physicists debate it in journals. You smirk, thinking, if true, Schrödinger's cat isn't both alive and dead. It's just waiting for the graphics engine to load. Skeptics counter with their usual arsenal. They argue that attributing consciousness to the universe or to all matter risks explaining nothing. If everything is conscious, then consciousness becomes meaningless as a concept. They also remind you that metaphors don't equal mechanisms. Just because quantum physics is weird doesn't mean it's proof of a cosmic mind. Still, even skeptics admit the hard problem of consciousness remains unsolved, and until it is, panpsychism and cosmopsychism sit on the table, annoying though they may be. You reflect on how these ideas echo back through history. Ancient cultures often treated the cosmos as alive. The Greeks saw psyche woven into the world, indigenous traditions spoke of Earth as a conscious mother, and Vedic texts described Brahman, the universal consciousness from which all arises. In a way, modern physics is circling back, with qubits and equations instead of myths and chants, but chasing the same suspicion that the universe isn't inert machinery, but an aware participant in its own unfolding. And then there's the unsettling thought: if the universe is conscious, what does that make you? A neuron in its brain? A fleeting thought passing across its awareness? Or a pocket of local self-awareness designed to glimpse the whole? You picture yourself as a wave curling on a vast ocean, temporary yet inseparable from its source. The ocean dreams you for a while, then pulls you back into its depths. It's comforting and terrifying all at once. As you stand beneath the stars in this cosmic hall, you feel the conversation shifting again. For all the grandeur of panpsychism and cosmic mind, you're reminded that science marches on, tethered to experiments and data. The speculation is intoxicating, but you sense the next stop will bring you back to Earth, the practical frontier of laboratories, brain scans and delicate instruments probing whether consciousness truly flirts with the quantum realm. The stars fade from view, and you step back into a world of white lab coats, humming machines and blinking monitors. After drifting through temples, dreamscapes and cosmic minds, you now find yourself on the practical science frontiers, where speculation must face the cold light of experiment. Here, the talk is no longer of ancient koans or cosmic souls, but of test tubes, brain scanners, and quantum devices cooled to near absolute zero. Yet even in these fluorescent lit rooms, the same mystery lingers. Can consciousness truly be traced to quantum effects? And if so, how could anyone prove it? Neuroscience labs hum with activity, mapping the brain with increasing precision. Functional MRI tracks blood flow, EEG records oscillations, MEG listens to faint magnetic whispers. These tools reveal correlations between thought and activity, attention and rhythm, memory and firing. But they remain limited. They show the where and when of brain processes, not the how of subjective experience. Some researchers now design experiments specifically to hunt for quantum signatures, though the challenge is staggering. Detecting coherence or entanglement in the soup of a living brain is like trying to hear a single violin in the middle of a hurricane. One avenue of exploration lies in biophotons, those faint flashes of light emitted by neurons. Sensitive detectors have recorded them, though their purpose remains mysterious. Some speculate they might serve as a communication channel, perhaps even a quantum one, carrying information across the brain faster than synapses alone allow. Historians still argue whether biophotons are signal or noise, but their mere existence adds intrigue. If neurons are flickering with tiny sparks of light, could those photons entangle or interfere, weaving subtle patterns that classical tools have yet to capture? Another frontier lies in the study of anesthesia, which Hameroff champions as a window into consciousness. Researchers test how different compounds interact with proteins in neurons, including microtubules. If anesthetics work by disrupting quantum coherence, as Orko suggests, then the effect should leave measurable traces, perhaps shifts in vibrational frequencies or changes in coherence times. So far, data is tantalizing but inconclusive. A quirky tidbit: some labs have chilled microtubule samples to near absolute zero and claim to observe vibrational patterns consistent with quantum states. Whether these vibrations survive at body temperature remains the million-dollar question. Meanwhile, quantum biology itself is blossoming. Photosynthesis, bird navigation, and olfaction have already forced skeptics to admit that quantum effects can thrive in messy biological environments. The next step is to test whether brains too exploit these tricks. Experiments are underway to probe cryptochrome proteins in humans, to measure coherence in neural tissue, and to simulate OR processes on quantum computers. None have yet delivered definitive proof, but the fact that serious funding flows toward these questions shows how far the conversation has moved. Then, there's the cutting-edge work in quantum neuroimaging. Some teams experiment with entangled photons to scan brains, hoping to achieve resolutions impossible with classical methods. If successful, this could allow direct tests of whether entanglement plays a role in neural synchrony. Imagine peering into the brain and not just seeing firing neurons, but seeing quantum correlations dance across regions in real time. Historians still argue whether this is feasible or just futuristic hype, but the ambition alone speaks volumes. On the computational side, researchers are building quantum-inspired models of cognition. These aren't quantum brains per se, but algorithms that borrow from quantum probability to model decision-making. Strangely enough, these models often outperform classical ones when predicting how humans actually behave, especially when we're irrational. For instance, people violate classical probability rules in choices, but quantum probability can capture the quirks. It suggests that even if the brain isn't literally quantum, its logic might rhyme with quantum mathematics. A quirky tidbit: marketing researchers have begun applying quantum decision models to predict consumer behavior. Yes, quantum mechanics may already know why you bought that extra pair of shoes. Skeptics, of course, remind you that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, but neither is it evidence of presence. Many quantum brain theories remain unfalsifiable until technology improves. They warn that seductive metaphors can mislead funding and public imagination. And yet, progress often begins at the blurry edges of credibility. If no one had looked for quantum effects in photosynthesis, the discovery would never have been made. Perhaps neuroscience too just needs sharper tools and bolder patience. What's striking is the convergence. Physicists, biologists, computer scientists, and philosophers all dipping their toes into the same pool. Interdisciplinary conferences bring together monks and engineers, anesthesiologists and quantum theorists. The mood is cautious but curious, like explorers mapping an archipelago whose islands might one day form a continent. Historians still argue whether this is the dawn of a new paradigm or just a detour destined for dead ends, but the willingness to look says something profound. The mystery of consciousness remains unsolved, and no avenue is too strange to explore. You walk the fluorescent corridors, hearing both the hum of machines and the murmur of human wonder. Somewhere between electrodes and equations, there might be a hidden doorway, a way to catch the quantum ghost in the act of thinking. Or perhaps the ghost will always slip through, reminding you that some mysteries are not meant to be solved, only lived. Ahead, a softer horizon opens. You've travelled through neurons, quantum cats, cosmic minds, and laboratories. All that remains now is to gather the threads, to settle into the unresolved, and to let the mystery cradle you like a lullaby. The verdict isn't about answers, but about how beautifully the questions sing you towards sleep. You leave the humming laboratories behind, and the world around you softens. The fluorescent lights fade into starlight, the hard edges of machines blur into gentle silhouettes, and you realise you've arrived at the final stretch of tonight's journey. It's time to settle into a dreamlike verdict, not the kind stamped with certainty or sealed in textbooks, but the kind whispered softly as you drift towards sleep. You've wandered through neurons sparking in the dark, through paradoxes of cats and qubits, through meditating monks and cosmic minds. Each step has offered possibilities, each room another reflection of the same riddle. Is consciousness a quantum mystery, or is the mystery deeper than even that question dares to reach? When you think back to the classical story, it seems tidy, almost too tidy. Neurons fire, chemicals spill, circuits light up, and somehow out of that, awareness flickers into being. It works well enough to explain behaviours, memories, reflexes, even pathologies. But the cracks in that story are real: the binding problem, the qualia puzzle, the sense of choice and free will. Then quantum mechanics steps in, bringing its dice rolls and paradoxes, offering metaphors that sometimes feel like mirrors. Superposition whispers of dreams, entanglement hints at unity, collapse teases at free will. It's tempting, almost irresistible, to stitch these threads together into an explanation. And yet, at each turn, the skeptics tug at your sleeve. They remind you of decoherence, of the fragility of quantum states, of experiments that fail to replicate. They caution against overreach, against turning physics into philosophy by force. They're not wrong. Orcore may be wrong, quantum brains may be mirages, and consciousness may turn out to be fully classical after all. But the skeptics, too, cannot explain why the world feels like something from the inside. They can map the brain's fireworks, but they cannot explain the warmth of love or the taste of strawberries. Their lantern illuminates the mechanics, but the glow of experience remains just out of reach. The dreamers, Penrose, Hameroff, Wigner, Stapp, dare to imagine consciousness woven into space-time itself. They build bridges between microtubules and collapse, between neurons and geometry. Maybe they're right, maybe they're not, but their audacity ensures the conversation doesn't grow stale. And as you linger with their visions, you realise science needs both kinds of voices, the skeptical hammer and the dreamer's harp striking tension into music. Historians still argue whether tonight's theories will be remembered as breakthroughs or curiosities, but the fact they are argued at all means they matter. Perhaps the verdict is not about proof, but about perspective. Whether or not consciousness is quantum, the parallels have value. They remind you that the universe itself is stranger than intuition can grasp. They show that the boundaries between physics and philosophy are porous, that mystery is not a failure but an invitation. They reveal that even after centuries of inquiry, the most intimate fact of your existence, awareness itself, remains unsolved, shimmering like a probability wave. So where does that leave you? Somewhere between certainty and wonder, between neurons and qubits, between science and story. Consciousness may be a quantum mystery, or it may be something even stranger, something we have yet to name. Either way, the journey matters more than the verdict. The act of asking, of wandering through paradox and possibility, is its own kind of consciousness, a mind reflecting on itself as the universe's most curious experiment. You lie back, letting the questions settle like dust in twilight. The room darkens, the air softens, and the hum of your own neurons becomes the lullaby. The verdict is not an answer, but a mood, a sense of awe, a willingness to live inside uncertainty, a smile at the thought that even sleep might be another collapse into a new frame of awareness. You've walked far tonight, but the mystery still stretches beyond you, infinite and tender. And as your eyelids grow heavier, the last thought drifts across your mind. Maybe the real quantum mystery isn't consciousness at all. It's the way questions can keep you company until you fade into dreams.